Hi, everyone. My name is Glennon. I am the moderator of today's session, and I'm really excited to welcome you. I want to cover a couple of quick logistical items before we get into our exciting conversation with Anne and Mary. We will be using the chat quite a bit throughout the session, so make sure that window is open. We will ask people at certain times to potentially come off mute, and so if you are interested in coming off mute in your participants window, there's the yes, no buttons, and you can see I'm highlighting yes at the moment for myself at the top of the participants, and you see a green check, so we can use that feature if you're willing to come off mute, and we'll call on you to do so. And we're really excited that everyone's here today for this discussion. We're excited to build on the conversation and the themes from this morning with Pedro, and are excited to discuss strategies to increase student engagement based on their lived experiences and maximize learning experiences. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters, Anne and Mary.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Let me just pull up of course, starting out smooth as possible. Just find my slides again here. Mary and I are very excited that you are joining us.
If you haven't already done so, you might just introduce yourself in the chat room. Just say who you are and what school or district you're from, and we'll just keep watch on all of that.
Okay. We good? You seeing my slides now?
Looks good, Anne.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. So good morning. Yeah, as Mary said, we'd love to use the chat, and Glennon, thanks for your intro. We'd love to use the chat throughout the session. We're going to ask you to do some brainstorming that we're going to take a look at. Also, just kind of checking in this morning with where you're from and maybe your position in your district. We'll go ahead and kind of kick off. So I'll go through our slides a little bit here, and then we can check that chat momentarily. So Mary and I are really excited because as we listen to Pedro, Dr. Noguera, we know that so much of what he raised are such important issues for all of us, regardless of what the context for learning is, but certainly in the frame of this pandemic. So we're going to cover in this pretty brief session 3 key ideas. The first is really thinking about engagement of our students, and do we have a shared definition for what that looks like? We're going to look at some research around that. Thinking about how we can use a system-wide approach to learning by using literacy as a foundation. And then the third piece is to think about the elements of problem-based learning, which we know are based on authentic engagement of students, and some interdisciplinary instruction, both to, again, maximize student engagement, but also sometimes to maximize instructional time that can be limited in our remote and distance learning world that we've all been living in. So why don't we take a minute and ask you to just, again, in the chat, which of these pieces might be of interest to you, and again, where you're from. And so Mary, I don't know if you want to just kind of share a little bit about what you're seeing in the chat.
Yeah, will do. Thank you all for introducing yourself in the chat. It's nice to see everybody. Yep. Leslie's looking at number 3. You're the first one I see. 1 and 3. Yep, engagement. Yep, redefining engagement. All of them have been hit, but I see a lot on the 3rd one, and I think others are just needing a little bit of context on redefining engagement. But it looks like number 3 is the winner, Anne.
Sounds good.
I'm seeing, okay?
And in many ways, the session itself is going to build on those pieces. So so I think, and then we will have time at the end for some question and answer. Mary and I will end on time to respect people's schedules, but if you want to hang around with us a little bit after I guess it's noon your time, we can do that. Okay, so really quickly, I know we have a lot of familiar faces in the group, and we're always excited about our ability to be in California as your partner. But this is our mission and vision from CEC, and for those of you who have been working with us for a while, this is actually a new and refined way of describing our mission and vision. So as you know, we believe that labor management collaboration is a foundational piece of effective collaboration, but we've revisited the way that we frame that, and you can see that we talk about partners to build collaborative culture and equitable evidence-based practices to support both adults and students. And then we want to strengthen systems so that all learners thrive. So Mary's going to talk a little bit about our approach to some of this, and I'm going to play Vanna.
So it's nice to revisit these four interlocking or interconnected areas of, I think, for us to understand the system as a whole. In order for us to actually get to the heart of teaching and learning, where we're really working to empower students in their own learning, where they own the learning, then that means we have to touch these other circles. And if you look at the blue one, why many of us are here, because we believe that labor management collaborative partnerships actually matter in what happens around empowering students. And the reason for that is because the partnerships that we're trying to help you establish and strengthen at the schools and the district level really help to transform in a good way the profession, okay? And even more today, we're looking at change like we've never seen it in our lifetimes, and maybe never see it again. And that transformation then allows us to rethink, as Pedro talked about this morning, rethinking pedagogy, rethinking instruction, and that in turn actually matters in how we empower students. So we talk about this from an inside-outside approach. In order to get to the, from the students, empowering students, we rely on the partnerships that we have in our system from outside, and then that in turn strengthens, that partnership strengthens what happens inside the system, inside classrooms in many ways. So just pay attention to that and see how that looks from your angle, and if you're using the labor management partnerships in that way. Then the second thing we thought made sense just for a moment to consider, many of you are starting, if you haven't already, you've been working at building some kind of a district level learning team. And you also try to do the same thing at the school level, some kind of overarching learning team and structure that brings all the players together, whether they're union leaders, union building reps, or whatever you call them, board members and so forth at the top. In the middle, the magic being in the middle with the school learning teams, this is the opportunity for you then, as learning team members, to basically open up the door to say, how are we working at addressing the needs of our children? What can we learn from all of our professional learning communities, whether they're grade level, whether they're content area. But if you don't have a way to loop the learning from the bottom of your system, which is the most important, up to the top, the decisions at the top oftentimes are disconnected from the needs at the bottom. So we're just trying to show you that this is one big cyclical piece, and the labor management work at the top, at the middle, and actually how we collaborate with teachers all matters in how we sort of see students succeed. We also want to just mention that we know there are many, many challenges, especially now more today than ever, around how to address the needs of children, especially in this new learning environment that we see. We can't address all of those today, so what we hope to do is acknowledge the rest of these pieces really do have to be thought of as we're talking about opening up our schools. What we wanted to spend time on today in this next 30 minutes is around student engagement. So know that we know we're going to slight some of the other pieces, but we want to go as deep as we can around this one. Also know Ann and I just have gone through a lot of the literature too and thought, what have we found? What have we learned from the various challenges that come from remote learning? And off to the left of the screen, we just said what we know everybody had about 12 hours maybe to start figuring out how to teach your curriculum, your learning in a digital way. So you had to do that overnight in a very radical way. Oftentimes we found that the challenges have oftentimes focused on task completion and attendance, not so much on engagement and learning. We would just had to focus on these other two pieces first. We also had to think about the family capacity to help support learning, and I'm sure you learned a lot about that. We also had to think about technology, or sometimes lack thereof, and lack of resources available. These are the challenges we found. And then, of course, looking at the needs of how to address the needs of our most vulnerable students. Now, if we've missed some that you think, boy, here's something that is a big challenge for us, would you please add those additional challenges in the chat room, and let's just see if we missed what we missed around what you know you have to deal with, the challenges of remote learning. And then while you're doing that, let's go over to the other side and see about remote learning opportunities. So the challenges always open up opportunities, especially with the new school year. So we're looking at how do we identify the learning outcomes that are essential. We have many, many, many standards. What are the ones that matter the most, the more essential standards we need to pay attention to? And then how can we be more creative in designing our lessons so it's depth over breadth? We're also looking at ways to break from high stakes accountability to really formative feedback in some way. So how do we look at the high stakes and move to a more appropriate accountability for student learning? There are greater opportunities to connect families in ways we've never dreamed before. I think a year ago, we would be thrilled to have had the kind of connections we've had with family, and all of a sudden they are partners in the students' learning. What can we learn from our parents and families around their lives as students? And then let's think about the opportunities for collaboration and also who we collaborate with. So what's the time, where do we have that, and how do we build it in ways that we never had before, possibly with digital? And again, think about some other opportunities that you've been thinking about that maybe we haven't had a chance to consider on this. And I know Glenn's been kind of keeping an eye on that. He's going to be our helper around some of the ideas that some of you have come up with. Okay.
Yeah, one that was shared was that as a challenge was that staff are not willing or wanting to teach virtually.
Right, right. We didn't talk so much about professional development or professional learning opportunities. That would be another piece about how do we help build capacity around that. You're right.
But an opportunity that came in from Susie was building trust and relationships to support a positive learning culture. And more opportunities are coming in now.
Yeah, great. No, they have to think about it.
And it does seem, some of what you're saying is the notion of, are kids there? You know, are they taking this as an opportunity to kind of check out, and parents not necessarily knowing how to maybe support that. Yeah. So lots of really good ideas in the chat.
And Anne, there's one other that says some children actually flourished with this new learning opportunity rather than saw it as a deficit. Yes. So we've got both of those, right?
Yep. Resources in other languages. So lots of, we know that this is a massive undertaking. But I'm glad these are all happening in the chat, and we'll make sure we kind of come back to some of these. So,
yep, all good. And of course, we're very, very worried, and we continue to be worried about the most vulnerable students. And you suggested ELL students and special needs students. So that worry is not going to go away. So as we reflect on the experience with distant learning, okay, we're basically looking at, here's another question, right? Do you think your instruction focused more on task completion and attendance, or were you able to really focus on the learning piece? We're interested in getting some feedback from you on that as well. And we talked about what are some artifacts that help tell the story. So, you know, what did you do around lesson and unit design? Did you redesign that? Who did you work with on that? What does your student work look like that you were able to collect? What feedback, if any, did you get from your students and families to help you understand what kind of formative feedback we have on that? And then what kind of collaborative conversations existed with your colleagues over this distance learning piece? My guess is you have not had much time to actually reflect on this because you've been working so hard to keep moving forward. We almost had about every 2 weeks, we got different guidelines from the states on here's what we're doing next. So take a few minutes. You might jot these down just for yourself and bring that back to your teams. but it's important to sort of think about some of these experiences from your point of view.
In the chat, we're seeing a fair amount about participation and ensuring, attendance to ensure that students were safe and engaged. So focus on engagement and attendance seem to be the drivers in the chat thus far.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. I think we're still trying to figure out, because we weren't grading a lot of the materials, what they actually learned during these last 3 months. Okay, thank you. And then I think the other piece is, since you mentioned engagement, how did we track engagement? Was it done through attendance? Did you do this in some way around completion of assignments? What other ways did you use? Because we are both very interested in this. What did you use to figure out whether they were engaged in this work or not, in the learning? And again, here we didn't have so much to add to this one. We were looking for you to help us on this. Yeah. Yeah. Judy mentions that the spring was such an emergency situation. We now have time this summer to actually plan for quality distance learning. I think that's exactly right. And reflecting on their experience will help you know how to plan forward.
I think too, Mary and I, over the past, few months, have had an opportunity to try to support districts as they figure some of these pieces out. And I think, we have to kind of even consider the developmental appropriateness, like Pedro talked about. In some cases, we're finding that the younger students are coming on camera, they're able to be seen where, when access is available. And then in some cases, the middle schoolers tend to be less likely to share on screen, which was surprising for some educators because of the social media piece. So lots and lots to consider. But I think our key takeaway here is going to segue us into this next conversation is how do we define, or in some cases redefine, student engagement? Because we know that while making sure our kids were safe and we knew where they were was key, we also want to try to make that pivot to ensure our focus is on learning and not just being present. And so we've got some ideas about how you might do that. So we want to start with, how do we define engagement? So part of our work is that we study pedagogy. Mary and I were both educators, and we are, teachers by trade. So we have our own depth of knowledge around this topic, which makes it a great one for us to be able to talk about. And so one of the things, when you hear a good idea, it's often based in research, and we can often do crosswalks between the research that one author or researcher does with another. So we picked the work of 3 people, but we know this is not the end. And so again, as you're listening and you have good resources, please share those in the chat as well. But we talked about the work of Philip Schleckley, who talked about engagement almost as different levels of engagement, ranging everywhere from rebellion, kids who are going to disrupt the learning for themselves and others, to those that comply, which we see a fair amount of in our schools, to that real authentic notion of student engagement. Michael Fullen and Joanne Quinn's work around deep learning talks about, character and citizenship and communication and critical thinking and collaboration. So breaking it down, how can we make this more abstract, mushy notion of engagement something tangible? And then some work that we're very familiar with a partner that we've worked with for a long time is a woman by the name of Charlotte Danielson. Her work is well known across the country, although not so much in the state of California, because her framework for teaching, what has been used across the country and actually internationally as a tool for teacher evaluation, which gave it a little bit of a stigma, but we still see great value in her research and her approach to teaching. And her work is built on a constructivist theory of learning, which is learning happens through the interactions and the co-construction of meaning in the interactions between student, teacher, and then the rest of the class. So some of what we're going to lay out for you in this session is based on this research. So some of the things that we think about when we talk about student engagement is the notion that kids are actually thinking. They're being asked to do something with their brain. They're intellectually active. So it's not just a hands-on activity, but it's actually a minds-on activity. They're being challenged no matter what their learning level or their skills and knowledge are. We make sure that they are being challenged to think in what they do. They're developing their understanding through what they do, not what somebody is telling them. They're discussing, debating, and answering questions. Oops. They're discussing, debating, answering questions, looking at patterns. They are often making choices about the work they want to do, but we know that that requires good, effective planning by the teacher to set up those choices. And then there's a lot of scaffolding that goes on so that kids can have access to the work. There's a saying that we need an entry point for every learner. So low bar, high ceiling. Everybody's got to get in. If the introductory task is something that I can't do independently, then we have to think about how to make that a more differentiated activity. One of the things we've seen with the high stakes testing and standards-based instruction is that the tier 1 instruction is a one-size-fits-all approach. And then we rely on the tier 2 and tier 3 interventions to fill the gaps for learners. And that's not what was intended when we think about MTSS and Universal Design for Learning. We have to make sure these tasks are accessible to all learners. Some other attributes of students who are engaged is that they're attentive, they're committed, and they're persistent. And they find value in the work that they do. So our good friend and my mentor, Patrick Dolan, would say, you know, this is about the learner doing it for him or herself. They find value in the learning. They're not doing it for their teacher. They're not doing it for their parent. They're not doing it, in the case of my children, sometimes so that they could get the car on Friday night. You know, there's actually something there that engages them in the work. So we've summarized this by saying, if we are going to design learning that's engaging, students have to have some choice and or initiative. And what we mean by that is they've got to do something. What are they going to do? They can't be passive in their work, right? And with the remote learning, we're able to track what they're doing more, but is it actually meaningful? We know that we need to be able to go deeper into concepts rather than covering a broad spectrum of content, which is why the opportunity to start to look and prioritize your standards is critical. We have to have students we have to provide opportunities for students to actually do some thinking. They can't just be recall questions. They can't just be summarizing something. There's got to be a creation, a creative piece, a co-constructing with peers or even with the teacher themselves. There have to be multiple levels of challenges we talked about, and the relevance and authenticity to their lives. And this is where we know culturally responsive pedagogy begins. It's with what we know about our students. So Mary and I were brainstorming together, and we were thinking about how might we give you some specific examples of what this could look like. So in many cases, when we're teaching reading comprehension, we ask kids to read a short passage and answer a factual question, because then we know if they can recall what they read, they potentially understood it. But we think there's a way to go deeper. So what if we did something like allowed students to find a news article or even a video, because we know with the tier 1 robust instruction, we need multiple modalities to access information. Let them pick the topic they're interested in and then share the key themes that they uncovered and why they matter to them. So we're still asking them to analyze text. We're still asking them to demonstrate that they understand it, but we're not doing it through a more compliance-based approach to instruction. Rather than asking kids to just do a mathematical problem related to geometry or capacity, what if we give them real-life problem-solving questions like, hey, we know we've got to reopen our schools. We know that we've got to have physical and social distancing in place. If this is the size of our room and this is the parameters, how many desks can we arrange in the room? And then Mary and I, as we actually tried to see if we could solve this math problem together, which we think we did, but that'll be a bonus for anyone in the audience. We also talked about what didn't we consider? What about the teacher's desk? What about if there's in the state of Illinois a radiator in the room? You know, what if there has to be you know, some technology in the front of the room that's going to take up that space? So really allowing kids to think about, you know, the work that they're doing. So I want you to just kind of pause and react to that, and think about, you know, what are the differences in these two learning experiences? What might that do for students, and what might the impact be on teaching? So go ahead and just take a minute, think about this, and again, share with us in the chat. We'd also, if you're willing to unmute, we'd love to hear maybe about how you've already applied this kind of thinking to your own practice. We have a few minutes for that. I'm seeing some things, class discussion and Zooms are difficult, right? And then there's some, Jennifer sharing global digital citizenship work. So anybody want to unmute and just share a reaction to this? Glenn, maybe if they raise their hand, or just go ahead and unmute.
Sure, yeah. If you want to come off mute, just click the yes green check mark in the participants window, or if you want, just come off mute and share. I'm happy to share. For me, like, this idea of really thinking about the challenge of coming back to a classroom is real and relevant for me as an educator. So I think it's also real and relevant to the students. So it's a fun design challenge, and without setting really strict parameters on it, you might get a bunch of different responses.
Right. Yep. We know just in Illinois, last night, I think about 6 o'clock, we just received the guidelines to reopen schools. And I can tell they were not as specific as maybe people had hoped for some people. And all of a sudden, the anxiety level for educators has actually been moving up higher, because they have to come up with more specific ways to address some common, they all have the same common problems. Just like we talked about, Pedro said, you have to work with basic needs of students first around health and well-being. And these are very important logistical concerns that don't even get into the learning, right? They just get into some basics, but you can actually include some of the basics. It's part of the learning experience if the students are brought into the problem-solving arena.
So a couple things have come up in the chat. Sorry to step on you there. So, you know, someone said that they almost exclusively gave problem-solving challenges to their students, but it was hard to get to demonstrate their thinking. They would happily show their answer, but to gain understanding of what their thinking was. And another person was asking for examples for our younger students, our littles, our first graders and younger. So I'll pause there.
Yep. So we'll get into that when we get a little further down the lane. And so,
Right.
but let's we'll just keep moving.
Thank you.
Mary, I'm going to kick it back to you.
That's all right. Yes. So we basically were looking at what are some of the implications then in order to authentically engage students. We have there's some contextual things. Pedro talked about some of those. What's those lived experiences? The more we know about our students and what their students' lives will look like these last 3, 4, 5 months before we see them again, the better. What knowledge and skills did seem to be either developed or lack thereof? What do we know that they have? What's their own self-perception of what they experienced and what that looked like? It will help us immensely if we have knowledge of their whole child, their physical well-being, their emotional, social, and intellectual growth. And then what's the family makeup? How many are living in one site? How many of them are in their sort of immediate container that they hang out with or don't hang with? What's their racial and cultural heritage that we need to pay attention to, especially today? And then also, of course, their poverty status, the socioeconomic status. All of those make a difference in helping us understand how to engage. The more we know, the better we can plan to meet their needs. And then we also have to think about the safe and inclusive learning environment. We got into that just briefly, but how it's hard to have high expectations and be able to work off of high expectations for all when you have students who are triggered at something that happened, and they actually then bring the learning, stop the learning for so many. And that happened, I have no doubt, on some of your Zoom meetings when you were trying to engage students and some kind of issue happened at home of one. It actually, everybody else had to deal with that as well. What's the safety? What's their willingness to take risks? You know, what kind of safety concerns have to be laid out? I may be fine to go into a classroom and others say, no, not me. And finally, you have to think about, it would help immensely if we think about the relationships. How do we build relationships with these students and continue building them when they come back to school with their families, and then they with each other? So the relationships matter, expectations matter, and safety all matters. That also brings us to looking at CASEL's SEL capacities. What we found is, if this was in the recesses of our mind, it should be front and center now, because we cannot possibly do what we just talked about in these last couple of frames appropriately if we have not thought about what these students' own self-awareness and the things that trigger them, him or her would be, and how they manage that. And then what happens when you put them in a social setting? What's their relationship skills in working with each other? And all of those pieces actually impact their own ability to make responsible decisions, both on how they're going to learn, how they comply, and also how they learn. So this is going to be even more important to all of you. If you're not familiar with this, I have a feeling you may have some other framework that you would use, but they look something along these lines.
Yep. And this is where Mary and I are, you know, that we're so excited about this conversation, but we're trying, so we know we cannot go academic without thinking about social and emotional learning, which is why we wanted to at least drop this in. So if we go back to how do we plan in a way that promotes student engagement, we have to be sure we know what the learning outcomes are. We need them to be clear, they need to be ambitious, they need to reflect the important content knowledge. And one thing, this is again, goes back to that robust Tier 1 instruction, they have to be suitable to a range of students. There have to be tasks and activities that align to the outcomes, and they consistently engage all students in the intellectual work of learning. And we have to make sure that the way we present information is rich, nuanced, and kids make connections. This is where we use the metaphors and analogies that we capitalize on the lived experiences of our learners. So this is a question that we sometimes ask: where does your practice have strengths and opportunities? We often know that teachers can talk about what they're going to do with students. Where I'm going to do this, I'm going to give this problem-based activity, and even though it's an engaging activity, there may not be clear on why they're doing it. So we really need to make sure we know the why behind our what, as they say. Assessment becomes critical because we have to start when we know that we've got kids coming in that have gaps in their learning. We also have to recognize that there are some students, as you've mentioned, who have thrived. We have, I was telling Mary, right across the street, 2 second graders playing together. They're in the same class with the same teacher. One mom says, it's a sunny day, I'm not putting him on the computer, I'm taking him to the, you know, whatever, a walk, taking them to the garden center to plant flowers. And the other one has their kid in the asynchronous, the synchronous learning, plus Khan Academy, plus a virtual field trip doing writing. Those 2 boys are going to go back into the same classroom, and their experiences have been different. So we have to make sure we know where our students start. We have to, as Pedro talked about, make sure our students get feedback. We need to make sure sometimes that feedback comes from other students. So I know we're limited based on the platforms that we utilize, but what can we do to set that up? Is it taking screenshots of work? What might that be? Again, we have to consider this in both the remote and face-to-face learning. And then reflection. Charlotte Danielson would say that if kids don't have time to take a moment and say, okay, what's the so what about this lesson? What did I learn today? They're less likely to put that into a place where they come back and revisit it. As teachers, we have to do the same thing. Mary and I will get off this Zoom and we'll chat and say, how do we think it went, right? What could we have done better? Did we talk about that slide crisply and clearly enough? So we have to make sure we're thinking about planning and assessment. I'm going to move into the second question. And this is a hypothesis that we've been trying out in a few places, because when we look at remote learning and we also look at reentry to school, what are some foundational pieces that the whole system can wrap their brains around, if you will? Now, you may have a different approach. Mary and I had some good collaborative dissonance on this. But the notion is there's a sense that no matter what the content is that we're teaching, kids have to read, write, listen, and speak. And so what if we identified some learning literacy standards that we would adopt throughout the entire system? So Taft Union High School, Blanca Cavazos was the superintendent who spoke yesterday. They're doing this in their district. They're going to pick a literacy standard, and then they're going to build some interdisciplinary lessons around it. When we use literacy as a foundation, we have to make sure we assess the knowledge and skills of our students as we re-enter school, whether that's virtually or face-to-face. We have to figure out how we're going to address the uneven learning experiences, and we have to think about innovative ways to group students or even design teacher teams to ensure that we can provide appropriate levels of rigor. In some cases, we see kindergarten and first grade teachers co-teaching in a summer school setting, and the first grade teacher is able to see where these kindergartners coming in. There's some schools that are going to do some looping with students so that they remain with the same teacher for the next year to help pick up where they left off, if you will. We think about these Common Core State Standards. This is one of the tools that we dropped into the resource folder. And we want to think about the standards as a tool because they lay out explicit skills, they give a range of expectations, and there's a coherent bridge from K to 12. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, except to say that in this document that comes from Student Achievement Partners, they've laid out these 10 key standards in 4 categories. And when we look at the way that they lay them out, they do them in grade bands. So we can see what it looks like for a 3rd grade, 4th grade, and 5th grade student, knowing that our 4th grade students may be operating more like a 3rd grade student. Some of our 5th grade students may be operating more like a 4th grade student and or up there with the 6th grade student. So if we were going to assign or design a formative assessment when we re-enter school, what might be a task we could ask that would cover this band of skills so we could capture where in fact kids live? We have the band for the same exact standard for 6 through 12. And then, sorry, that's a mistake on the slide. That should say 9 through 9th. Oh, it does. Sorry, 9th and 10th grade and 11th and 12th grade. So when we think about a systems approach, depending on if you're an individual teacher, you're part of a school team, you're looking at this from a district perspective, and maybe you're a unified district that covers the grade levels, you can build consistency in your system by simply anchoring on some shared standards across the system. So Mary, I'm going to kick it back to you to talk a little bit now about this notion of problem-based learning. And what we're trying to do here is think about, okay, we brought engagement, here's what it looks like. Here's potentially some anchor standards we can all hang our hats on. How do we pull this all together for a rich learning experience for students?
Right. If we just think of engagement is linked to meaningful work, then that opens the door very differently for our children. One of the first steps, though, that we have to think about is to some extent clear off the plate. We have more and more standards that we're trying to go with. I think you talked earlier, it's like we do the breadth, not the depth in some way. So one of the first strategies or activities we should be doing this summer is try to prioritize what are really the essential standards, let's say in literacy, and what are those learning outcomes for students. Once we do that, then we can start to integrate those so it's not isolated, siloed thinking and working. We don't do that. We don't work that way out in the real world. We integrate skills and knowledge and information all the time and make connections. So how do you integrate the literacy skills with those social-emotional learning competencies so it's not one or the other, but it's all? And then the third one then, what does success look like? What kind of assessment might we think about criteria-wise to help us know if they've got it, if they understand it? And the last one is thinking about then designing learning activities that will help to link those kinds of learning and incorporate the knowledge and the skills from multiple disciplines. I talked to a PE teacher not long ago, and she said, Mary, my concern is I'm going to be irrelevant. And I said, don't you think these children need physical activities? Can you think, look at the TikTok activities with music that are happening. That can be very motivational. How do you look and link up with other teachers and planning together so you're addressing the needs of the whole child? Those are meaningful activities that you have to rethink, okay? So the idea is, if we can begin to, especially with colleagues, school-wide, team-wide, all of the above, select key instructional goals. Make sure there's less, not more, okay, in this pandemic arena. Determine the assessment or the evidence that we're going to want to utilize on whether they achieve those learning goals. And then think about how we develop and design coherent instruction that's linked together in many ways rather than separate siloed effects. Those are the 3 steps we're talking about with this kind of work. I know Judy Fancher from Jacinto La Puente would be able to talk about this, because their schools a couple of years ago said, you know, we've got standards and we've got assessments, but we're interested in building meaningful activities around real life learning, real life knowledge-based skills. So they basically used these deep learning competencies, which are global competencies that if you talk to anybody in the world of work, will say they look to hire and acquire staff people that are critical thinkers, that have some sense of character, that know how to collaborate and work with others, that understand their work, their position in the world as a citizen and citizenship, that know how to communicate broadly and deeply, and that are creative and flexible. And all of a sudden, we find that we are in the middle of that where we are today. These would give you some areas to sort of open up the door to around learning, around problem-based learning, based on some of these real-life ideas. I think with extending literacy, and Anne, you can join us in on this, you're thinking about that interdisciplinary project. I taught health and home economics in many times. My whole world of teaching was trying to figure out, what are you teaching so I can learn to apply it in my classrooms? I collaborated with teachers almost from the very start, because I knew my responsibility was helping the kids and students learn how to use and adapt some of the learnings that they had in their other classrooms. So what's the topic you want to learn more about? You might ask students. Are you working alone? Do you work with a partner? How do you do that? They can help make decisions around this if you ask these questions. And you might talk about the literacy match a little bit here.
Yeah, so depending on the age and developmental capacity of your students, and then the work that you do as a district, even asking the students, what is the standard that you'll be addressing in this project? It could be that you've already, like in Taft Union High School, they're focusing on the standard number 7. So they've already identified what they're going to work on. So if I'm working on using multiple forms of media to gather information, and that's the literacy standard, then what does that look like in my science? How am I transferring that over to my biology class or my math class? And then in most cases, we want to make sure that they are going to create something to demonstrate what they've learned. It could be that they're going to create a paper. It could be that they're going to create a TikTok, as Mary said. It could be that they're going to, do some kind of a speech. But what is it that they're going to develop?
Yep. And I think we're wrapping this up, but here we are in the last couple of slides. Look for the teachable moment. Think about how we provide meaningful learning opportunities. And if you look at the next slide, I think the idea is you can do this by picking one topic you might put, or theme you might put in the center of the universe of this line, and think about how, let's say I'm going to deal with butterflies today with my first graders. How does science and climate fit into that? What are some math pieces to that? You get the idea. How do you basically touch on all of those pieces so this interdisciplinary unit may be something that happens and we can pull on from the pandemic arena today, but we'll just go with butterflies because we just could do with a little bit of happiness around something fun. But you get the idea. As you work with students, they can help you design their own learning around things that matter.
one of the districts that we're working with, as you sort of go up the ladder of the age of the students, the topics start to change. But what's been very fun to watch is one first grade teacher talked about she got everybody their plant piece, you know, their seeds and their soil and their cups, and they were all, you know, they're using math to measure their plants to see how they're growing. They're using science to make predictions about what they need to do with the soil and what would happen if they, you know, what their hypothesis might be about their plant if they put it near the window or they keep it farther away. The teacher herself has been forgetting to take care of her own plant because she's so busy planning lessons. So the kids are getting a big kick out of the fact that her plant is not growing as well as hers. And so she's able to sort of turn it over to the kids, that they are the experts. And so what we're seeing from that is some of these pieces: student enthusiasm for their learning, relevancy because they're able to make connections, and then parents being engaged because their kids are so excited about their learning. We do have a resource that I'll share with you when we get to the end here, a planning tool that we've developed that kind of helps us think about some of these pieces to bring it all together, so that if in fact this was something you were thinking about trying to explore, we took a problem-based learning template and simplified it and created ways to kind of actually plan out what we've been talking about today. But we wanted to make sure that we also, you know, brought up this notion of collaboration, as Mary started at the beginning, the idea that, you know, we have a belief in the way that we approach systems, that if we can get it right at the district level through our district learning team, support and empower those school leadership teams to be clear about your goals, your mission vision for students, and then really foster that collaboration around with the adults that engage learners. That's how we run an effective system. So given this, we may need to think about how would planning time have to be restructured, because what we're asking teachers to do right now is not something they've been doing in the past, and really truly takes a lot more time than maybe what we've done, at least initially. As I've talked to some teachers, they feel like it gets smoother. What shifts to department and grade levels meetings might need to be made. So if you're typically only meeting as a biology team or as a science department, how are you going to get sort of that expertise of your English department colleagues to help you think about that? In the elementary world, it's a little bit different because in many cases we're teaching all of those subject areas. But if we want to incorporate art or music or PE, as Mary talked about, how would we make that time available? And then we have to be sure that we don't treat our special ed students and our EL students and our students that struggle with trauma. Everybody could be at the table for the planning, and then we build on the expertise, some of the strategies our special education colleagues might have about how to scaffold instruction. It may be as effective for a student with an IEP as a student that doesn't have the IEP. Our counselors could help us consider some trauma-informed practices. Our instructional support staff have been, as in many of the districts, there's potentially one of two things happening. People aren't sure how to maximize the talents of the instructional support staff that are so critical to the face-to-face instruction. And in other cases, they've been just teaching right alongside, helping to facilitate some of those breakout conversations with students. So these are all pieces. You can't do it without the time and the collaboration, but we know that's important.
We are out of time, actually. We're a little past time, so.
I think we're just about there, yeah. So.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're right at time. As next steps for everyone, this is now transitioning to your lunch break from now until 12:45, and we hope you'll join us back in the main Watch Live room during the lunch break. There are a bunch of great district videos. We will also be hanging out here to answer any questions that may have come up. So you're welcome to hang out here. I did put a link to the Google Drive resource folder in the chat, and it's also in the session description on Swapcard. And we will add these slides to that resource folder as soon as we're done with the presentation here. So with that, I want to really say thank you a lot to Mary and Ann, and we're going to stay here and answer any questions you might have. I did see a couple questions come in, so I'll start with the questions that did come in during the session. And if you have a question, feel free to come off mute or type it into the chat. The first thing that I saw as a question, how do credits and grades work in distance learning situation? Our student body is really struggling with access and time, and our population is 85% free and reduced lunch, and the newcomer and EL magnet school. So I guess, what have you heard any strategies for addressing assessment, grading, credits in this current distance learning situation?
We do know that in our state, the guidelines basically said thou shalt not grade them. So that created the issue that many probably find, that if you don't have any accountability at all set up, it's very difficult in the middle of a distance learning to motivate them, because they're so used to the extrinsic accountability, not the intrinsic accountability. So to some extent going forward, we have to move, I think the challenge for us is to move away from the external more and help them find the importance of the learning. If it's more relevant to them, you don't have to worry as much about the other piece, because that means we own it if we have to hold them accountable in some way. So it's going to be an interesting mix for us to sort of figure out. Sometimes I've seen a couple of teachers lay out a contract in a loving way, say, what do you think you want to go after on this? Let's think about what your learning goal is here, and how do I help you get there? It moves you to, rather than teaching, more of coaching, more facilitating their learning, like you would a career coach. How do I get you from where you are today to where you want to be? That usually means more one-on-one conversations than just 25, 50 people in a class.
The other thing I would just add is, when assessment criteria has been explicit for students, at least in some of the cases that we've been, whether they're being graded or not, but they still have clear, explicit assessment criteria, they're more inclined to produce work that aligns with those standards. So again, I totally agree, Mary. It's that internal. We may not be getting a grade externally, but if I'm getting feedback, that's helpful.
Thanks for that. An additional comment that came in, which I think leads into a question. One of our participants said, I'd like to be able to go beyond students presenting to students actually engaging with one another. And so I think the question that comes out of that is, what are some strategies to encourage peer-to-peer student engagement in this distance learning environment?
Mm-hmm. I get excited about that possibility, don't you, Ann?
Yeah, I think that the technology piece of it, we've got to start with what access do we have, right? And so, because we can't necessarily, in the same senses that we might be able to say to a student, you're going to work on this project, you need to get together outside of school to get it done. At a secondary level, that's probably a fairly appropriate ask. At the elementary level, however, it may be a little more difficult. So can there be these breakout rooms? Can there be, Google Meet, office hours where kids can connect? The one thing I would say about teaching kids to collaborate with one another is you have to explicitly teach kids how to do that. You can't just put kids together and say collaborate. And so some of the best ways that I've seen it done is start with 2 kids, start with partners, because that's the most psychologically safe spot. Nobody gets an out because it's just the 2 of us. The minute we put 4 kids in a group, somebody can potentially opt out. So I think it's about, starting with partners, maybe a trio, and really explicitly teach, okay, how do we put our ideas on the table? How do we brainstorm together and identify some of those key ideas? So I think it's stepping back maybe 10 steps more than we thought we might need to explicitly teach those pieces. And in fact, the learning outcome might be, how do you co-construct a definition of, a word so that you can both own it.
It also doesn't mean it has to be grade level peers. You could actually have family projects or family efforts that working together in some way. You can also look at what's a community need and encouraging them to to consider what's happening in your neighborhood or your community that maybe could use a problem that exists that maybe could use some help. I worry, for instance, around our nursing homes and thinking our poor elderly parents and grandparents that are almost always cut off from everybody. Is there a way that maybe students could think about addressing that problem in some fashion that's totally different and build in around a problem? It's a problem-based learning approach. Kimberly's got a hand up, I see.
Yeah, I saw Kimberly trying to come off mute. So Kimberly, you want to come off mute?
Yeah, because it's too long in the chat. I was going to start doing it in the chat of what I saw in the classrooms that I supported. What I saw was that they were doing like a student of the week. And then, so to go peer to peer, then the students had to ask that student of the week questions. Okay, like what is their favorite color? What do they really like to eat? Simple questions. Then they had to write a letter saying, oh, well, very encouraging. I understand that your favorite color is blue, and then also asking another question about, that they wanted answered that didn't get answered. So it was multi-leveled, and I thought it was wonderful, the creativity of these teachers that they did this kind of thing to do the peer-to-peer communication through DL.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Thanks for sharing, Kimberly. Really appreciate it. And as I was reflecting on what Anne and Mary were saying, I wanted to present an idea. I mean, it sounds a lot of this is about developing routines. And so creating the structures to enable collaboration. One of the questions that I saw come in earlier was about how do you show student learning beyond just what the answer is? And I would present the idea of thinking routines that you can use that have simple structure to them, that then the student can follow. One thinking routine that I learned from Maker Ed was parts, pieces, and complexities. So you have a student examine all the parts of a stuffed animal, the pieces, and then the complexities, and they can map out those different components. So that's another way to think about developing routines that can be used to demonstrate and really make student learning visible.
Yep. These actually, I just think, Glenn, these kinds of things, opportunities create some passion and excitement for teachers too, right? It just, I call these passion projects, and I mean that for all of us. Something that's meaningful and important to us as well.
Sure. So it's 12:07. We want to make sure that everyone has a chance to go to lunch. We'll hang out here for another couple of minutes. If there's a final question or two, we're here to answer them, but we're done with our formal programming. As I mentioned before, Anne or Mary will drop the slides into the resource folder, the Google Drive folder that we had, along with all the other 8 or 9 resources that they had. Are there any final questions from the crowd? Feel free to come off mute if you'd like, or type it into the chat.
I have a question about integrating project-based learning with schools that are already using a workshop model and units of study. Because if you're brand new to the units of study and the workshop model, that is a huge undertaking, but project-based learning is also a huge undertaking, and to think about like how to manage that and the ways that maybe there can be some connections between the two so it feels a little less overwhelming.
Sure. Typically anyone I know that they don't jump into one or the other. They usually go, what is one area, maybe one unit, one lesson, one thing that we might work off of to try it. Maybe 2 teachers are interested in maybe collaborating on a lesson or a unit, and they try to find ways to do what you just talked about. So it doesn't mean overnight you go to a problem-based learning, everybody's in, okay? It basically goes, I'm willing, are you willing? Let's try this in some way. Because you're not stepping away from standards, you're just basically rethinking some of your opportunities for creating learning opportunities. You're creating different instructional or pedagogical practices in many ways. That's how I see most people try it, one step at a time, one person maybe at a time. And then from that, if it's successful, then you can try a 2nd unit or a 3rd unit, or maybe 3 or 4 people. Maybe it goes to grade level. It can go that grassroots bottom up, if that helps.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for such a great session. Really enjoyed having everyone here. Thank you, Mary and Anne, for leading us through this session.
Thank you very much.